He wrote the check. 2 hours later, he was dead. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. It's always a thrill to see. Your support means everything. Let's get started. It was a particularly sodden evening in early October when the peculiar telegram arrived. The lamplight flickered against the damp panes of 221B Baker Street, and the fire struggled valiantly against the persistent chill that had crept into the corners of the room. I'd only just settled into my armchair with the latest edition of The Lancet when Mrs. Hudson tapped discreetly at the door and handed Holmes the telegram with an expression that suggested more curiosity than alarm. Holmes tore it open in a single motion and read it silently, his expression sharpening as he reached the end. "Well, Watson," he said at last, with a glint in his eye, "how would you like to assist in a murder case in which the victim appears to have paid handsomely to be killed?" I lowered my journal. "Surely you jest." "On the contrary. This," he said, handing me the telegram, "is an invitation of the most unusual sort." Telegram received at 4:11 p.m., October 3rd, from Inspector G. Lestrade, Scotland Yard, to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, urgent, man found shot dead in Westminster townhouse. Circumstances bizarre. Appears to have transferred £10,000 to unknown party days before death. Police baffled. Suspect suicide disguised as murder or vice versa. Need your expertise immediately. £10,000, I repeated, stunned. That's a king's ransom. Holmes nodded. And far too princely a sum to vanish without consequence. Come, Watson. We must not keep Lestrade waiting. The fog tonight may yet yield clarity. We arrived at 42 Gresham Place shortly before 6 o'clock. The house, a tall and narrow structure of respectable but unremarkable character, stood on a quiet street flanked by iron railings and gas lights that hissed against the gloom. A constable stood at the door, tipping his hat nervously as Holmes stepped past him and into the narrow hall. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the sharp, unmistakable scent of cordite. Lestrade stood beside a billiard table in the rear salon, his brow furrowed, his mustache more agitated than usual. "Evening, Holmes?" "Doctor," he said briskly, "I'll admit it. I've never seen a case like this." The body lay near the hearth, face turned slightly toward the wall as though startled by something just beyond the room. He was a man in his mid-40s, well dressed in a burgundy velvet smoking jacket, his hands neatly folded. A bullet hole marred his left temple. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no missing valuables. "The deceased," Lestrade said, "is one Mr. Lionel Hubert Glenross, financial advisor, unmarried, lived alone. Housekeeper found him around 2 o'clock. Neighbors heard nothing." Holmes knelt silently by the body, examining the wound, the placement of the hands, the ash still burning in the tray beside the armchair. He sniffed the air, then stood, his expression unreadable. "Any weapon found?" he asked. Lestrade shook his head. "None. And yet the doors were all locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. No one saw anything. And then there's the money." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Transferred from his account last Tuesday. £10,000. Sent to a solicitor by the name of Crispin Melbury, with instructions to release the funds to an unnamed party upon proof of Glenross's death." "Proof," I echoed. "A signed death certificate, which, naturally, I'm in no hurry to issue." Holmes moved about the room, pausing at the window and fingering the edge of the heavy velvet drapes. "Tell me, Lestrade, who else has been in this room since the discovery?" "Just myself, the housekeeper, Mrs. Wyatt, and 2 constables. None of us touched a thing, well, apart from rolling him slightly to confirm death." "Of course." Holmes returned to the fireplace, crouching again. He picked up a small piece of what looked like torn paper near the baseboard. "Curious," he murmured. "May I?" I asked, stepping forward. He handed it to me. It was no more than a quarter of an envelope, the corner bearing the embossed initials GL in faint gold script. No address. No stamp. "There's more, Holmes," Lestrade added. According to the housekeeper, Mr. Glenross had been acting odd for the past fortnight. Jumpier than usual. Stopped going to the club. Cancelled meetings. She says he began locking his study and refused callers. "Fear," Holmes said softly. "Or guilt. Possibly both." He turned to the door. "Watson, we'll need a thorough inventory of this man's financial dealings. Lestrade, I suggest you hold off on any declarations of suicide or natural death. This case is far from closed." "Do you suspect foul play, then?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Lestrade, I suspect something far more intricate. When a man transfers a fortune days before he dies and leaves no clue as to why or to whom, we must assume he expected his own death, but not necessarily by his own hand." As we stepped out into the fog-choked street once more, Holmes paused at the edge of the iron railing and glanced back at the dark windows above. "Watson," he said quietly, "what sort of man would arrange for his own murder, and why?" I had no answer, but I knew then this would not be a straightforward inquiry. We returned to Baker Street that evening with rain clinging to our shoulders and silence heavy between us. Holmes removed his coat with absent-minded haste, casting it over the back of a chair, and immediately set to pacing before the hearth, his brows furrowed deep in thought. I, still unsettled by the calm dignity of Mr. Glenross's corpse and the macabre notion that a man might arrange his own murder, poured myself a brandy and offered Holmes one, though he barely noticed the gesture. "I must admit," I said after a moment, "this case already defies comprehension. If not suicide, then some elaborate plot, and yet the evidence points in neither direction decisively." Holmes stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "That is precisely the allure of it, Watson, the ambiguity. The elegant simplicity of the scene, so carefully orchestrated, and yet behind it lies something grotesquely intricate. Do you recall what Glenross was wearing?" "Yes, a burgundy smoking jacket and grey trousers." "Indeed, and not a single crease. He dressed for death, Watson. That alone tells us the manner of his demise was anticipated." "You mean he knew the hour of his murder?" "I believe so," Holmes replied. "And not just that. He welcomed it." The idea sent a chill down my spine. What sort of man calmly prepares for his own execution? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he retrieved his violin and began to pluck at the strings absent-mindedly. The sound, thin and tentative, hovered in the air like a spider's thread stretched between two thoughts. After several minutes, he spoke again, softer now. "We must speak with the solicitor, Crispin Melbury. It is no small thing to be entrusted with a transfer of £10,000 under such strange stipulations. Either he is complicit, or he is a man entirely unbothered by ethical ambiguity." It was the following morning, damp with mist and the faint scent of coal smoke, when we arrived at the offices of Melbury and Crane, a modest firm tucked between a tobacconist and a photographer's studio just off Chancery Lane. The brass placard on the door gleamed with the sort of pride found only in long-established but undistinguished legal offices. We were ushered into a narrow room with high windows and dust-softened bookshelves. Mr. Crispin Melbury, a gentleman in his late 50s with thinning hair and a permanently surprised expression, rose at once to greet us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said with a quick bow. "Inspector Lestrade mentioned you might be calling." Holmes seated himself without invitation and fixed the man with a gaze so penetrating it might have bent steel. "I understand you recently executed a financial transfer of £10,000 on behalf of Mr. Lionel Glenross. Might I ask the purpose of that transaction?" Melbury adjusted his cuffs, visibly unsettled. It was most irregular, I'll admit. Mr. Glenross appeared in person last Tuesday, requesting that the funds be deposited into a holding account under my stewardship. He delivered a sealed envelope containing instructions and insisted that it be opened only upon official confirmation of his death, which you now possess. Melbury nodded. Yes, though the envelope itself named no recipient. Instead, it bore the simple instruction, "Deliver to the bearer of this seal." He left a small gold signet ring with the letter V etched upon it. I have it locked in the safe. Holmes tilted his head slightly. A bearer's seal. Intriguing. You did not question this arrangement. Melbury flushed. I did, but Mr. Glenross was quite adamant. He offered a generous retainer for my discretion. He seemed in full possession of his faculties, troubled, perhaps, but not deranged. I presumed the matter to be of a private and possibly romantic nature. Holmes smiled thinly. Did Mr. Glenross ever mention feeling threatened? Melbury considered this. No, though he did ask me, almost idly, whether the law could compel a man to testify if he wished not to. Curious, Holmes muttered. Did he mention anyone by name? Melbury shook his head. No one. He left as abruptly as he came. With a quiet sigh, Holmes rose. Mr. Melbury, I advise you to hold all transactions until this matter is concluded. Scotland Yard may seek a full record of your conversations with the deceased. As we stepped out into the cold light of the London morning, I could not help but speak my mind. Holmes, surely this signet ring and bearer clause suggest some elaborate blackmail scheme. Glenross could have been coerced. Perhaps, Holmes said, his gaze distant. Or perhaps he sought to purchase silence or retribution. We walked for several moments in silence. Holmes halted suddenly at a newsstand and purchased the Times. He flipped it open, and his eye caught something halfway down the page. Ah, and now we have another thread, he said, tapping the column. I leaned over his shoulder. It was a short article tucked between stock reports and theater listings. Mysterious disappearance of art dealer. Mr. Franklin Veitch, prominent antiquarian and dealer in rare manuscripts, has not been seen since Monday evening. Last known address, Wandsworth. Police inquiry pending. Veitch, Holmes whispered, the seal. You believe this man to be the intended recipient? I believe, Holmes said, folding the paper, that Mr. Glenross may have died to protect or to silence Mr. Veitch. Either way, he is the only lead we now possess. We go to Wandsworth. The journey southward passed in a haze of speculation. Holmes stared out of the window as the grey terraces of London slid past, his fingers steepled, his mind turning over unseen gears. When we arrived at the modest row house belonging to Mr. Veitch, it was shuttered tight, though the milk sat untouched on the stoop and yesterday's evening standard was sodden at the doorstep. Holmes produced a slender tool from his pocket and deftly worked the lock, murmuring, "Forgive the intrusion, Watson. I have reason to believe the police will thank us later." The air inside was stale, tinged with turpentine and old vellum. The front room resembled a cramped museum, cluttered shelves of medieval texts, brass instruments, and dusty antiquities. A journal lay open on the desk, and Holmes pounced on it at once. "Tuesday, entry written in haste," he said, reading aloud. "Met Glenross again today. He insists he is ready, still refuses to name the buyer. Warned him again. Once the transfer is complete, there will be no way back. He understands. He insists he must disappear completely. I fear the guilt weighs heavily." Holmes looked up. "Watson, we are no longer merely looking at a murder. We are looking at an arrangement so calculated, so deliberate, that it may extend beyond the grave." I felt a strange cold settle in my stomach. Then Glenross did know he was going to die. But for what reason? What guilt could compel a man to engineer his own erasure? Holmes closed the journal and turned to me with grave certainty. One that must be hidden so thoroughly, so irrevocably, that the only witness left standing would be the man who vanishes. He looked around the room once more, eyes sharp. But Veitch is missing, and now the hunter must become the hunted. Holmes moved swiftly to the mantel, where a small ivory figurine sat askew. He picked it up, revealing a folded paper beneath it, no larger than a matchbox. He opened it slowly. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes read aloud, the words barely above a whisper. "The debt is paid. Do not look for me. Some truths are best buried. V." The room fell into silence once more. And then Holmes said, almost to himself, "Unless we find Mr. Veitch, we will never know who truly arranged the death of Lionel Glenross, or why he believed it necessary to vanish from the world forever." And with that, the case twisted once more, pulling us into shadows neither of us had yet named. Holmes remained still for a moment longer, the slip of paper trembling faintly between his fingers, as if the words it bore had stirred something fragile within him. Then, with a soft breath, he folded the note once more and slipped it into his pocket. "Come, Watson," he said briskly, stepping back into the narrow hallway of Veitch's flat. "There is nothing more to be gained here, not immediately. But this changes the complexion of the affair in a most provocative way." Outside, the mist had thickened into a steady drizzle. We walked side by side down the glistening pavement, boots echoing faintly against shuttered shop fronts. Holmes's steps were quick, precise, almost impatient. "Do you believe the note to be authentic?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes replied without hesitation. "It matches Veitch's hand from the journal, but its content is not the farewell of a man in danger. Rather, it is the announcement of someone retreating into deliberate obscurity. That distinction, Watson, is the axis upon which this mystery turns. You think he's still alive?" "I do, and he wishes not to be found. That in itself is significant. It suggests that his role in Glenross's death, whether direct or indirect, was premeditated and mutual. But what could possibly unite two men in such a grim pact? Glenross prepares his own murder, Veitch vanishes, and a fortune is left dangling between a solicitor and a bearer's seal. It's madness." Holmes stopped suddenly at the edge of the street and hailed a cab. "It's design," he said as we climbed in. "Not madness. Veitch may be the only man alive who knows the truth, and his disappearance may be the final act of concealment." "Where now?" I asked. "To Glenross's club. You recall Melbury mentioned he had ceased going. That change in habit is always worth noting. A man may sever professional ties in moments of crisis, but social habits? That takes fear, Watson, and fear has a face." The Langham Gentlemen's Club sat tucked discreetly in Cavendish Square, behind polished oak doors and a facade of cream stone. It was the sort of establishment that prided itself on discretion and lineage, offering a sanctuary to those who carried the burden of London's higher responsibilities. Inside, everything smelled of cigars and old leather. The steward, a balding man named Chillingham, greeted Holmes with a flicker of recognition. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, may I be of assistance? We seek information about one of your members," Holmes said gently. "Lionel Glenross. We understand he was a regular until recently." Chillingham's expression darkened. "Yes, Mr. Glenross dined here most evenings. That is, until 2 weeks ago. He resigned his membership rather suddenly." "Did he offer a reason?" "No, sir. Merely sent a letter, curt and final. We do not inquire in such matters." Holmes tapped his cane lightly against the polished floor. "And yet, perhaps you observed something strange in his final visits?" Chillingham hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. He seemed troubled, distracted. Twice he left without finishing his supper. Once he knocked over a decanter and stared at the stain as though it were blood. But what struck me most was the gentleman who visited him here, one evening near closing. Holmes's eyes lit with interest. "Describe him." "A tall man, darker complexion, possibly of Spanish or Levantine descent. Well-dressed, though not ostentatious. They spoke briefly in the corner drawing-room. No raised voices, but when the man departed, Mr. Glenross looked quite pale. "Did he give a name?" "I'm afraid not, sir. He signed in as Mr. V." We exchanged a glance. Holmes's face sharpened as though he'd caught a scent. "May we see the ledger?" he asked. Chillingham hesitated, but at length returned with a leather-bound logbook. Holmes paged through until his finger stopped on a line. "Here, September 20th. Mr. V. Guest of Mr. Glenross. No further notes." "May we take this page?" "Certainly not, sir, but you may copy it." Holmes scribbled the entry quickly and stood. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Chillingham." Back in the cab, Holmes grew uncharacteristically silent. He studied the note he had just copied, comparing it with the slip recovered from Vetch's mantle. "Same initial. It aligns. But there's something else, Watson. Consider the implications. This man, V, visits Glenross shortly before Glenross liquidates a small fortune, cuts off all social ties, and arranges his own death. Vetch disappears. But the signet seal left with Melbury bore the letter V, and Melbury never laid eyes on the recipient. You're suggesting the recipient was not Vetch?" Holmes gave a small, tight nod. "I believe Vetch was the intermediary, Watson, not the final recipient. He helped orchestrate the act, but the person for whom Glenross paid this price was someone else entirely." I stared at him. But why would Glenross go to such lengths? "To atone," Holmes said simply, "or to silence something." We were nearly home when the cab was halted by a constable near St. Martin's Lane. The man recognized Holmes at once and stepped forward with urgency. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, sir. Inspector Lestrade sent me. Said to find you anywhere I could. There's been a development." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Go on." "Another death, sir. Name of Walter Tilling. Found this morning in Lambeth. Single gunshot, similar execution. But there's more. Tilling was a clerk with Glenross's firm. Quiet man, never married, lived alone. Cause of death? Shot through the heart. Execution style, no weapon. Same sort of neatness as Glenross, almost ceremonial. House not ransacked, nothing taken." Holmes turned to me. "Another cog in the wheel. The game is deepening, Watson." I felt the tension rise anew. "You think Tilling was involved? Or he knew something? Either way, he was silenced. And now we must race time, for I believe this affair is far from over. There is an architect behind this sequence, and we have not yet seen his face." Holmes leaned forward and tapped the roof of the cab. "To Lambeth," he commanded. "At once." And as the cab turned southward into the thickening mist, I knew we were hurtling toward a truth more dreadful and complex than either of us had yet imagined. The house in Lambeth stood in sullen silence, a squat row home nestled between a boarded-up chemist and a laundress's shop that had long ceased its work. Rain fell in steady sheets now, softening the city's sounds into a murmur. As we stepped inside, the scent of pipe smoke and damp wool lingered faintly, clinging to the walls like a memory reluctant to leave. Lestrade met us at the narrow stairwell. His coat was soaked through and his mustache hung low with moisture, but his eyes flickered with something beyond irritation, something close to unease. "He was shot clean through the chest," the inspector said without preamble. "No forced entry. No signs of a struggle. House was locked. The landlady says he always bolted the door from the inside." Holmes removed his gloves slowly. "And the time of death?" "Roughly midnight. The landlady heard nothing. Milk left untouched this morning. Same as Vetch." "Show me." The sitting room was modest but tidy. A single lamp burned low beside a worn armchair. Walter Tilling sat slumped as if sleep had simply overtaken him, save for the red blossom of dried blood on his waistcoat and the faint slackness in his jaw. His spectacles still rested on the bridge of his nose. Holmes knelt wordlessly and examined the scene with surgical care. He inspected the bullet's entry point, the untouched teacup, the folded newspaper on the armrest. Then, without a word, he opened the small desk drawer beside the chair. From within, he withdrew a packet of letters, bound by a length of twine and marked in neat handwriting. Private, to be destroyed, unread. Holmes did not obey the request. He untied the bundle and skimmed the contents quickly, eyes narrowing. Correspondence from Lionel Glenross, he muttered. Dates back over 3 years. They worked closely, it seems. But look, this one is dated 2 weeks ago. He handed it to me. I read aloud. My dear Walter, if you are reading this, then the time is almost upon us. I am resolved to my course. There is no redemption for what we did, only silence. You must burn the remaining ledger and speak to no one. The sum I promised will be delivered to you within days. Use it to begin anew, anywhere but here. V will handle the rest. Trust him as I have. Yours in shame, Lionel Lestrade scratched his head. What ledger? And what on earth did they do? Holmes stood. Something illegal. Something they believed would catch up with them sooner or later. But note the language, Watson. V will handle the rest. Glenross placed their fate in this man's hands. That makes him more than an accomplice. He is the executor of judgment. Then this V, whoever he is orchestrating a purge, I said slowly. Glenross, perhaps out of guilt, accepted it. But now, Tilling has been eliminated, and Veitch has disappeared. That's 3 men linked, 2 confirmed dead. Precisely, Holmes said, his tone clipped, which means there may be more. He turned back to the body. But this was not just execution, Watson. This was prevention. Glenross had secrets. Tilling held copies, perhaps a memory of the ledger. If even one of them had decided to confess, the entire scheme could unravel. Lestrade crossed his arms. So what's our next move? We don't even have a proper name for this V. No, Holmes replied. But we do have a pattern, and patterns, Lestrade, are fingerprints of the mind. We left Tilling's house under the veil of dusk. Holmes walked quickly now, muttering to himself between bursts of silence. 3 men, all linked by finance. Glenross, a wealthy advisor. Tilling, his clerk. Veitch, the antiquarian. 1 disappears. 2 die. All within 2 weeks. Why the timing, Watson? Something must have changed. Something recent. Holmes stopped. Exactly. Glenross didn't fear exposure 3 years ago. He feared it now. Whatever they did, it had been safely buried, until some new threat emerged. As he spoke, he pulled from his coat a small envelope, taken from Tilling's desk. Look at this, a bank draft for £4,000, issued to Tilling from the same solicitor, Melbury. But Melbury said Glenross's only arrangement was the £10,000 sealed payment, I said. Holmes smiled coldly. Melbury may have been more involved than he let on, or he may have been unwittingly used. Either way, we returned to him. That evening, we arrived once more at Chancery Lane. Melbury's office was closed, but a light burned on the upper floor. Holmes knocked firmly, and after a pause, the solicitor himself answered. Robe hastily tied, eyes rimmed with fatigue. I wasn't expecting you, he said. Holmes held up the draft. Then this will come as a surprise. You processed this on behalf of Glenross, did you not? Melbury paled. Yes, I did. But it was only a private transaction. Glenross asked that it remain unrecorded. I assumed it was a family matter. Even after learning of his death, I hadn't connected it, Melbury stammered. It was one of several quiet payments. He was liquidating assets. I didn't think. How many others? Holmes asked sharply. Melbury hesitated. 2 more. One to a Mr. Edwin Larch, an accountant, and another to a man named Farrington. Retired solicitor. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Do you have addresses? Certainly. Here. He retrieved a card file and scribbled 2 lines. "Good evening, Mr. Melbury," Holmes said, already turning. "And thank you for your cooperation. Though I do suggest you prepare yourself. Scotland Yard may request your full records before long." Back on the street, Holmes studied the names. "Watson, we may now have the full list of conspirators, 5 men bound by guilt. Glenross, Tilling, Veitch, Larch, Farringdon. Glenross accepted judgment. Tilling followed. Veitch fled. That leaves 2. You think Larch and Farringdon are in danger?" "Undoubtedly. Then we must warn them." "We must reach them first," Holmes corrected. "Because if V finds them first, Watson, they will vanish, either into silence or the grave." The cab turned sharply onto Ebury Street toward the first address. The gaslights blurred through the rain-soaked windows, and the sky above churned like ink in water. Holmes sat with his hands clasped, his voice low and thoughtful. "This is not merely a story of blackmail or fear. It is a morality tale, Watson. One orchestrated by a man who sees himself not as a criminal, but as a judge." I glanced toward the wet window pane where the city slipped by, oblivious and shadowed. "And judges," Holmes finished, "rarely leave their verdicts unwritten." It was nearing midnight when we arrived at 18 Ebury Street, the residence of Mr. Edwin Larch. The house was modest, yet bore the trim of respectable means. A gas lamp flickered on the corner, casting long shadows across the stoop. Holmes stepped out of the cab with urgency, scanning the windows. There was a faint glow behind the drapes on the second floor, too dim for reading, too early to be retiring. He knocked smartly 3 times. We waited. Nothing. He knocked again, sharper now. At last, we heard movement from within, and the door creaked open just wide enough to reveal a pale face peering out. "I'm not accepting visitors," said the man behind the door. "Mr. Larch, I presume?" Holmes's voice was even, but firm. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We've come to warn you. You may be in grave danger." The door opened further. Larch, thin, bearded, his face drawn with fatigue, studied us a moment, then ushered us quickly inside, bolting the door behind us with trembling fingers. "I knew someone would come," he said, barely above a whisper. "Not the police, though. I thought perhaps—" "Him." Holmes stepped forward. "You've been contacted?" Larch nodded. "Not directly, but I've felt it. Watched the news of Glenross, then Tilling, God, poor Tilling, then Veitch's disappearance. I knew it would come for me eventually. I sleep in the day now, lights out by nightfall, no visitors, and still I can't stop waiting for the knock." "Then you know why we're here," I said. Larch turned and walked into a cramped drawing room, motioning for us to follow. A coal fire crackled low. Papers littered the desk. Some account ledgers, others sealed envelopes. "You were one of the 5, Holmes said. "Involved in whatever crime Glenross died to keep buried." Larch nodded slowly. "It wasn't meant to be a crime. Not at first. It was an opportunity." He sat, fingers knotting together tightly. "Glenross discovered an investment loophole, buried in old land tax transfers. Government land quietly reclassified as private holdings after the wars. With the right filings and the right seals, he said we could leverage it. Just long enough, he said, to borrow what won't be missed. 12 parcels of land, each showing ownership gaps. Veitch provided forgeries, land titles, estate records. Tilling managed the paperwork through Glenross's firm. Farringdon handled the legal language. I was the auditor. I made it all look clean." Holmes listened in perfect stillness, his gaze unmoving. "We siphoned the profits through shell properties. Glenross funneled the proceeds into a blind trust. He always said it was temporary, that we'd return it within a year. But the fund grew faster than anyone predicted. Too fast. Veitch wanted out first. Said it felt like blood money, but by then it was too late. If even one of us confessed, we'd all hang. So Glenross divided the accounts. We drifted apart, and then years passed. No one spoke. What changed? I asked quietly. Larch looked up, eyes ringed in red. 2 months ago, Veitch contacted Glenross. Said someone had found the records, an original land registrar's book from 1865. Said he hadn't destroyed it after all. It had been misplaced in his own collection and sold at auction by mistake. Now it was out there. The whole scheme could be exposed. Holmes leaned forward. Did they discover who purchased the book? Larch hesitated. Glenross never said, but he believed it would surface. And so he chose his punishment. I think he felt it was the only way to protect the others. I think he paid for silence. But silence wasn't enough, I said. Tilling was murdered. Veitch vanished, and now your name is next. Larch swallowed hard. If there's someone behind this, someone eliminating us, then Glenross failed. Holmes stood. You will not remain here tonight, Mr. Larch. Pack only what is necessary. You'll come with us. Scotland Yard will arrange protection. I'll speak to Lestrade personally. As Larch disappeared down the hall to gather his things, I turned to Holmes. So it was about land theft, forged deeds, financial gain veiled in legal shadow. Yes, but that is only the act. What interests me is the author of the epilogue. Holmes's voice was low, measured. Someone now moves through the shadows of this scheme, assuming the role of executioner. Not for profit, not for gain, for retribution or justice in his own twisted terms. And the book? I asked. The registrar? That is our key, he said. Whoever now holds it, holds the truth. Veitch's note said, the debt is paid. I believe that was not merely to Glenross, it was to the book's new owner. A sudden knock at the door startled us. Holmes froze, hand gesturing for silence. Another knock. Then a voice, calm, low, cultured. Mr. Larch, it is time. Holmes crossed the room in 2 strides and extinguished the lamp. Larch stood at the hallway threshold, suitcase in hand, his face bloodless. I knew he'd come. Holmes whispered, upstairs. Quickly. Watson, the service revolver, top left coat pocket. I retrieved it and passed it to him as Larch fled silently up the rear stair. Holmes flattened himself against the wall beside the door. Another knock came, gentler now, almost patient. Mr. Larch, the voice repeated. I ask only for a moment. Holmes flung the door wide, revolver raised, but the step was empty. Only the fog swirled in the lamplight. He stepped out, scanning the street. A lone figure in a dark coat turned at the corner and disappeared into the mist. He knew we were here, Holmes muttered, and he chose not to confront. I stepped out beside him. He's watching, still deciding. Holmes nodded grimly. Yes, and that means he's not done yet. Behind us, Larch stood at the stair rail, shaking. Holmes turned to him. Tell me, Larch, this man, V, did Glenross ever describe him? Larch hesitated. Once. Said he wasn't born of the scheme. He was pulled into it. A shadow at first. Then, a reminder. What does that mean? I don't know, Larch said. But Glenross feared him, not because he was dangerous, because he was certain. Holmes turned back toward the misty street. Then we must reach Farringdon before certainty finds him first. We departed Ebury Street with Edwin Larch in tow, bundled into the back of the cab as if he feared the very shadows pressing against the windows. Holmes gave strict instructions that he was to be escorted to Scotland Yard and placed under protective watch. Lestrade, roused from his quarters by urgent telegram, promised to assign a plainclothes man to his door before the hour was out. Holmes's face remained unreadable throughout, his eyes narrowed in that particular manner I had come to associate with the quiet assembling of a mental mosaic. Each piece sliding into place, though the full image remained veiled to all but him. By the time we reached the final address on Melbury's list, the fog had thickened into a heavy pall, clinging to the street lamps like gauze. Number 6, Bellington Row, stood apart from its neighbours, a crumbling Georgian terrace with ivy clawing across the facade and windows that reflected nothing. The air smelled faintly of rotting leaves and rusted iron. Holmes paused on the threshold and glanced up at the darkened upper windows. No light, no sound. We're too late. The door was ajar. He pushed it open slowly, revealing a musty corridor with faded wallpaper peeling in strips. Dust swirled underfoot, disturbed only recently by footprints leading inward. Holmes followed them without hesitation, and I shadowed him closely, revolver in hand. The sitting room revealed itself in pale gloom, lit only by a distant gaslight filtering through the sheer curtains. Charles Farrington sat upright in a leather armchair, hands folded neatly in his lap, his head tilted slightly toward the window. His face bore no expression, no sign of terror or pain. Only a small, perfectly round wound at the base of his skull betrayed the truth. Holmes exhaled through his nose, quietly. "Third man dead in under a week," I whispered. Holmes circled the chair slowly, eyes roving. "Notice the similarities? No mess, no forced entry, no sign of robbery. This was not a killer in haste. This was ritual." He moved to the desk beside the chair and opened the top drawer. Inside, resting atop a bound legal volume, was a folded envelope addressed to no one. He opened it. There is no justice without cost. There is no silence without sacrifice. The debt ends here. Let this be the last. Holmes handed it to me without a word. He was already scanning the bookshelves, the mantel, the hearth. Thick tome sat on the desk, Farrington's own legal annotations. Another book lay open beside it, the history of post-war land holdings in Greater London, marked with a red ribbon at Chapter 6. "Watson?" Holmes said softly. "The source ledger. Look here. Margin notes in Farrington's hand. Cross-references, addresses, dates." He was reviewing the records. "You think he was preparing to confess?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that he had begun to regret his silence, perhaps even planned to destroy what remained of their trail." He drew a folded note tucked into the book's end paper, dated just the day before. "To be delivered to Mr. Crispin Melbury, solicitor, upon my death. Dear sir, I leave in your hands a sealed record of all transactions related to the Glenross Land Trust. Should any further party perish by unnatural cause, I instruct you to open the enclosed and submit it directly to Scotland Yard. The weight of our past is no longer bearable." C.F. Holmes snapped the book closed. Then the killer came not only to silence, but to intercept this confession. If Farrington had succeeded in sending this to Melbury, our case might already be in the open. I stared down at the lifeless figure. Then V knew. He must have been watching, just as he watched Glenross. Tilling, Larch. He's ahead of us at every step. Holmes turned sharply. "Not ahead, Watson. Present. Always one shadow behind." He pulled open the bureau drawer. A thin space revealed a wax-sealed envelope stamped with Farrington's initials. Holmes pocketed it carefully. "We take this to Melbury at once, and if he has sense, he will submit it unopened." But as we turned to go, Holmes paused, staring out the narrow sitting-room window. A figure stood across the street, motionless. Tall, draped in a long coat. We could not make out his face in the fog. But there was something in the posture, the unnatural stillness of it, that sent a prickle down my spine. Holmes did not move, nor did the figure. Then, without haste, the man turned and walked into the mist. "He wanted us to see him," I said. "Yes," Holmes murmured. And that was no threat. That was declaration. We returned to Chantry Lane with the envelope in hand. Melbury was still awake, nursing a glass of brandy in his study. He opened the door with great reluctance when he saw us standing there again. Holmes handed him the sealed note. This was recovered from Farrington's home. He is dead. Melbury paled, fingers trembling. Another? He left this for you, his final act of conscience. Melbury read the instructions aloud, then clutched the envelope tightly. I will send it to Scotland Yard at once. You will do more than that, Holmes said. You will accompany me there. Tonight. You are now the last custodian of a dead man's truth, Mr. Melbury, and I fear the architect of this reckoning is not yet finished. Melbury nodded numbly. Yes, of course. I will come. Holmes turned to me. Watson, the pieces are nearly all in place. The final stroke lies not in the past, but in the confrontation to come. Our phantom, our V, believes he holds the final word, but I intend to speak before he does. He paused, his voice low. There is one place left to visit. Where? Where it began. Where the book changed hands. He looked at me, eyes alight with cold precision. The auction house. And at last, I understood. The ledger, the true origin of the downfall, had passed through one set of hands. That buyer, known or unknown, had become both witness and executioner. Holmes stepped into the night again, and I followed, drawn by the knowledge that the end was no longer distant. It had already begun. By the time the hansom reached St. George's Crescent, the mist had begun to thin. The veil of fog that had dogged our steps for nights seemed to part as we approached the discreet frontage of Bexley and Worth antiquarian auctioneers. A brass plate shimmered dully in the lamplight, and behind a locked iron gate, a single gaslight still burned within the vestibule. Holmes drew his coat tighter around him and climbed the steps without hesitation. He rapped twice on the door. For a moment, there was nothing. Then slow footsteps approached from within, deliberate and without urgency. The door cracked open, and a bespectacled man in a midnight blue waistcoat peered out. "We are closed for the night," he began. Holmes presented his card. "Mr. Oliver Worth, I presume. My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We seek information regarding a recent acquisition, one that passed through your hands 3 weeks ago, a bound ledger of 19th century land registries." Lot 107, Worth's eyes twitched just slightly before he stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd best come in." We followed him through a narrow passage lined with empty glass cases and into a small office cluttered with auction slips, receipts, and catalogues. Worth moved behind his desk and sat without invitation. "I'd rather not become involved in anything unsavory," he said. "Then your best course is honesty," Holmes replied evenly. "The ledger, Worth. Who bought it?" Worth adjusted his spectacles and reached for a leather folio. "Yes, Lot 107, consigned by a private collector, sold under a general manuscript lot. The ledger was not catalogued with any particular distinction. Frankly, I suspect the seller didn't know its significance. But the buyer did." "I believe so. There was an agent," Worth said, flipping to a page marked in red pencil. "A woman, tall, grey coat, spoke with a northern accent, bid modestly but precisely. She purchased 3 lots, paid in cash, gave a name, Miss Violet Grayson." Holmes leaned forward. "Grayson? I doubt it was her true name. Do you have a forwarding address?" Worth shook his head. "None. But the courier receipt indicates she had the lots delivered to the reading room at the British Library. Parcel was signed for the next morning." Holmes stood at once. "Then that is where we go. Watson, quickly." Worth rose behind us, voice lower now. "Mr. Holmes, if this is about the murders, I suspected as much. Something about the way she carried herself. Not criminal, no, but absolute. Like the matter was already settled. Holmes paused in the doorway. Yes, Mr. Worth, that is precisely the sort of person we seek. The British Library loomed silent under the pre-dawn haze, its great stone lions cloaked in shadow. The main entrance was, of course, locked at such an hour, but Holmes had foreseen this. We made for the side entrance where deliveries were handled, Holmes producing a folded letter stamped with the signature of Sir James Thorncroft, an old acquaintance and occasional benefactor with influence in scholarly circles. After a brief delay, the night porter, weary and blinking, admitted us to the lower archives with the air of a man convinced he would later regret it. The reading room was dim, the dome above us lost in darkness. Holmes walked slowly through the rows of oak desks, eyes scanning the ledgers and newspaper archives scattered about. At the far end, near the index drawers, he stopped. "Here," he said softly. A long wooden desk bore the marks of recent use. Ink still wet in a blotter, a set of notes pinned beneath a small weight, and beside them, a slip from the auction house confirming receipt of 3 lots, signed in a delicate hand. V.G. Holmes read the notes carefully, his gaze narrowing. Names, packages, notations of sale transfers and forged seals, each one traced back to the Glenross scheme. She knew everything, I whispered. Not just the crime, but how it was done. And she annotated it, Holmes replied, lifting a slip of paper. Read this. To erase a crime is to accept its silence, but to avenge it is to give it voice. I've chosen the latter. Each man bought the silence of the past with stolen wealth. Let each man pay it back. 1 coin for 1 name. Holmes looked up slowly. She's not punishing them for the fraud. She's punishing them for what it cost someone else. A heavy silence fell between us. Holmes turned to the library index. Watson, help me. Search all legal cases or civil disputes involving Glenross's firm between 1865 and 1890. Look for claims of inheritance disputes, property seizures, bankruptcies involving land. We set to work, combing the index drawers with quiet urgency. It was Holmes who found the entry first. Here, he said. Eviction proceedings filed by Glenross and Company against one Henry Grayson, dated 1886. Property near Fulham, seized under the very parcel ledgers Glenross's group manipulated. The case was overturned, but the claimant died penniless 2 years later. I read the next entry aloud, my voice low. Daughter, Violet Grayson, attempted petition in 1890, denied by the court for lack of standing. Records show the land had already been resold. Holmes stood in silence, the full arc of the matter settling around us like ash. She was the victim's daughter. She found the ledger, understood it, traced every man responsible. Glenross, Tilling, Farringdon, Larch, Veitch. And now she's executing justice, one by one. Holmes's jaw tightened. She never vanished into the past, Watson. She was waiting, watching, and the moment that book surfaced, she stepped into the light. A heavy creak echoed from the far end of the room. We turned. A tall figure stood in the threshold between the reading room and the hallway beyond. A woman, late 30s, perhaps older, dressed simply in a charcoal overcoat, her gloved hands folded before her. Her gaze was level, unafraid, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. I knew you would come, Mr. Holmes. You never miss the final page. Holmes did not move. Miss Grayson, I presume. She nodded once. You've uncovered it all, then? I've uncovered enough to know the law will not see this the way you do. No, she said softly. It rarely does. Holmes took a step forward. You still have a choice. I already made it, she replied. Long ago. I have no wish to vanish, Mr. Holmes. I came here tonight to leave the last of it behind. She placed a small leather satchel on the desk. It made a soft thud. Holmes opened it. Inside lay the ledger, now heavily annotated, and 3 folded letters, each addressed by hand. To Scotland Yard, to the Crown Prosecutor, to you. She met Holmes's gaze. I did not kill them in hatred. I killed them because they built their futures on the ruin of others, on my father's grave. And the others? Holmes asked. Those still living? There are none. I stared at her. You mean Larch? She shook her head. He left London. I made sure of it. He knew fear better than remorse. That was enough. Holmes was silent a moment. Then he turned to me. Watson, fetch Lestrade. He did not look at Violet Grayson again. She stood without resistance, hands folded, eyes unblinking. And as I stepped out into the grey light of dawn, I knew this case had not been solved in triumph, but in mourning. Justice, I thought, had many faces, but none more haunting than the one that wore a calm smile and walked freely into its own end. The rain had softened to a whisper by the time Lestrade arrived at the British Library. He entered the reading room in his usual brisk manner, coat damp, expression folded into a frown that rarely strayed far from irritation. His eyes moved swiftly from Holmes to Violet Grayson, then to the satchel resting on the desk. Holmes offered no flourish of introduction. He merely gestured to the satchel and said, Your case, Lestrade. It is all in there. Lestrade crossed to the desk, unfastened the bag, and peered inside. As he lifted the ledger and the folded letters, his expression shifted from skepticism to something quieter, more uncertain. She confessed, he asked, still not quite believing it. She presented the facts, Holmes replied. You'll find the confessions implicit in every name, every figure, every annotated line. Lestrade looked up at Violet. She met his gaze evenly, without hostility or defense. If anything, there was a weary calm about her, as though her part in the matter had concluded long before she stepped into this room. I don't understand it, Lestrade muttered. You could have gone to the police, brought this forward properly. No, she said. The law would have buried it beneath statutes and denials. Glenross and his men knew how to cloak their sins. I only made them visible again. Holmes stepped forward. What you did, Miss Grayson, was more than vengeance. It was an act of reconstruction. You unearthed every deception, traced every thread. You saw what even I failed to anticipate. She turned to him, and for the first time, her composure wavered. Just slightly. You think I should feel regret? I think regret is the privilege of those who believe they had another path. Her expression softened, almost grateful. She did not answer. Lestrade cleared his throat. Well, this isn't the sort of thing that fits neatly into a file, but you've handed me a confession. Evidence. I've got no choice but to take you in. I didn't come here to escape, Violet said. Only to finish. Holmes nodded once. Then let it be finished. Lestrade gestured toward the exit. She moved without resistance, her boots silent on the stone floor. At the door, she paused and turned back to Holmes. You said something earlier, that I still had a choice. Yes. She studied him for a long moment. You were right, but that choice was made the day the court told me my father never existed on paper. I simply followed it through. Then she left, coat vanishing into the grey light that had begun to bloom behind the storm clouds. Holmes and I remained in the reading room long after the footsteps had faded. The silence was not oppressive, but contemplative, each of us reviewing the pieces that had fallen, the weights that still hung suspended in the air. I moved to the desk and opened the letter addressed to Holmes. It bore only a single line in Violet's elegant hand. Truth is not what we uncover, Mr. Holmes. It's what we choose to carry. Holmes folded the note slowly, then tucked it into his breast pocket. We stepped out into the pale morning. London was stirring. Carts rattled down the cobbled streets, newsboys shouted the early headlines, and the city, as ever, moved forward unaware of the storm it had just weathered. Yet something about the light seemed different, as if the sky itself had acknowledged the weight that had been lifted. As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes remained unusually quiet. At last, as we turned onto Wimpole Street, he spoke, not with his usual clarity, but with something closer to introspection. "There are cases, Watson, that demand of us only observation and deduction. They yield to logic. They confess beneath the weight of evidence. But this was not one of them." I said nothing, knowing he would continue. This was a story written in shadow, one that demanded not just answers, but reckoning, and reckoning does not always wear the garb of law. "She forced a truth into the light that none of them had the courage to face," I said, "and she paid for it." Holmes gave a faint nod. "As did they. At Baker Street we found a telegram waiting. Lestrade's hand was unmistakable. Grayson in custody. No resistance, no confession beyond the materials provided. Scotland Yard reviewing ledgers. Commissioner involved. Matter classified pending review. We'll keep you informed. PS Press already sniffing. Not sure what we'll tell them." Holmes handed me the telegram and lit a cigarette. The smoke curled in delicate spirals, as if reluctant to disturb the air. "She left nothing more to be said," he murmured. I sat in the chair opposite him, suddenly aware of how heavy my limbs had grown. "You'll write it up?" he asked, not looking at me. I nodded. "Yes, though I doubt I'll publish it. Not in any form the world would recognize." He gave a faint smile. "Then you will have done her justice." There was no celebration that day, no grand triumph, only the quiet closing of a book. And as the shadows lengthened over Baker Street, Holmes returned to his violin and played a piece I did not recognize. Something slow, solemn, and strangely beautiful. A requiem, perhaps, for those who carried truths too long in silence. And I, as ever, wrote it down. The following days passed in a strange quiet. The city, as Holmes often said, had an extraordinary talent for absorbing scandal. Violet Grayson's name never once appeared in the papers, nor did those of Glenross, Tilling, or Farringdon. The public knew only that a sealed financial investigation had been opened into a string of estate irregularities, a matter of archival misclassification, as one polished headline put it. The full truth, like the ledger itself, was folded back into silence. But silence, I discovered, carries its own weight. Holmes sat longer at his desk now, reading but not turning pages. He smoked more, but spoke less. The violin remained near to hand, but its strings lay untouched. It was not melancholy, exactly, that had settled over him, but rather a rare kind of stillness, the kind that arrives only after encountering something outside the bounds of rational order. Holmes had pursued justice before, and he had uncovered tragedy. But this case had given him both, threaded through a single, solitary figure who neither begged forgiveness nor demanded absolution. One afternoon, perhaps a week after Violet Grayson's quiet arrest, I found Holmes sitting by the window, staring out at the street below, where a lamplighter moved from post to post like a ghost with fire. "She asked nothing of us, Watson," he said suddenly. "No pardon. No sympathy, no help. I set down the notes I'd been reviewing. She didn't need it. Number said, but people who do not ask are often those who deserve it most." His words lingered in the air. I could not answer. That evening, a knock sounded at the door. A sharp, purposeful knock that broke through the fog of reflection like a stone against still water. Mrs. Hudson answered, and a moment later, Inspector Lestrade stepped into our sitting room, his hat in hand, his expression unreadable. Holmes rose. "Lestrade?" "Evening, gentlemen," he said. "I come with news." He did not sit. He remained standing by the fireplace, as if the weight of the words he carried demanded the posture. "The Crown has reviewed the evidence, the ledgers, the letters, the sealed records, enough to put half a dozen ghosts on trial if they were still living. But as for Miss Grayson, they've declined to prosecute. I blinked. Declined. Lestrade nodded. No official charges. No conviction. She's being released under the quietest terms imaginable. The whole affair is being sealed under Crown discretion. Holmes said nothing for a long while. I argued against it at first, Lestrade went on. Said it would make a mockery of the law. But then I looked through the ledger again, line by line, the weight of it. I saw what she saw, not just what they did, but who they buried along the way. Dozens of names, Watson. Families displaced, inheritances erased, and not one of those men paid for it in life. Holmes finally spoke, and so she balanced the scale. Lestrade exhaled, the breath coming from someplace deeper than weariness. She'll be watched, quietly. There are terms, but the final page has been turned. He replaced his hat and paused at the threshold. I never liked unsolved endings, Holmes. But some stories, maybe they were never meant to be solved, just understood. He left without another word. Holmes remained standing long after the door shut. The next morning I found him gone from the flat. No note, no destination. He returned just after noon, the collar of his coat damp with dew and an odd calm in his step. I visited a grave, he said simply, unprompted. Fulham Cemetery, Henry Grayson. I looked up. Her father? He lies in an unmarked plot near the western boundary. No flowers, no stone, but someone had placed a single violet on the soil. There was a long pause. She has not disappeared, Holmes said, but I doubt we shall see her again. I closed the notebook in my lap. There is one part, I said after a moment, that still haunts me. Holmes arched a brow. She said she didn't kill Larch. No, Holmes replied. She didn't. You knew? I suspected, he said quietly. The pattern changed. No note left. No final gesture, and when she spoke of him there was no past tense, only relief. She wanted him to live, Watson, because he was the only one who might carry the guilt longer than she could. That was punishment enough. I sat back, absorbing the thought. Then who killed him? Holmes stared into the fire. Perhaps no one did. You mean, perhaps fear did its work, or perhaps justice does not always require a hand at all. He stood, stretched slightly, then looked at me with a faint smile. But that chapter, Watson, I leave to your pen. Write it as you see fit. And with that, he reached for his violin. This time, he did not hesitate. The bow met the strings with certainty, and the notes that followed were neither mournful nor triumphant. They were searching, unfinished, and real. As I opened my journal once more and began to write, I found that I too did not have all the answers, but perhaps the truth was never in the solution. It was in the weight we carried after. The autumn deepened around us, and with it came a quietude I had seldom seen settle over Holmes for so long. He took no new cases. The correspondence that usually cluttered the breakfast table lay unanswered in a neat pile, tied with string. He read little, smoked less. And though he did not say it, I sensed something had turned in him, some inner lever that had always been aligned with law, with logic, had shifted slightly off axis. Not broken, but altered. It was on the fourth morning of this stillness that a thin envelope arrived. No stamp, no address. It had been slid beneath the door in the early hours. The only mark on it was a faint V, drawn in black ink as delicate as spider's silk. Holmes opened it slowly, almost reluctantly. I leaned forward, expecting a final reckoning, some delayed confession or explanation. But there were only 3 lines. Mr. Holmes, not every end is justice, but sometimes it is mercy. There was no signature. He turned it over twice, then folded it and placed it inside the cover of his Stradivarius case. We won't hear from her again, he said. I did not ask how he knew. He simply did. But the message sat with me like unfinished music, the final stroke of a hand that had already laid down the brush and yet could not resist adding a final shade to the canvas. Holmes, too, seemed to accept it not as closure, but as echo, a whisper that would ring only for those who had heard the silence before it. That afternoon, I suggested we go walking. The streets were crisp with falling leaves, and a thin wind wound its way through Marylebone like a sigh through an old house. We made our way past Cavendish Square and turned east toward the embankment. Holmes said little, but I could feel him slowly re-entering the world. As we passed a bookseller's stall just outside Charing Cross, he paused. A battered volume had caught his eye, The Ethics of Punishment in Roman Law. He opened it absently and smiled, only faintly. Curious how civilizations change their laws, but rarely their instincts. I nodded, unsure what to say. She understood that, he added after a beat. Grayson? She operated not within the law, but within something older, more primal. And yet she left the truth, I said. For us, for someone. She left it because she had already finished with it. We moved on. The Thames shimmered grey and indifferent beside us. Holmes tossed his glove onto the stone railing and leaned out over the water for a long moment. She never meant to kill Tilling, Watson, he said suddenly. I turned. You're certain now? Yes. He said it not as theory, but as certainty. His death, too clinical, too soon. It bore the mark not of vengeance, but of fear. Glenross may have made peace with what was coming, but Tilling did not. Someone acted out of desperation. Perhaps Veitch. Perhaps a name we missed. Grayson covered the gap because the story required it. Then it was never a complete chain, I murmured. Just the semblance of one. Precisely. A tale shaped to its own logic, and when she entered the final chapter, she made it whole again, even if the lines didn't match the facts. We walked in silence until we reached Westminster Bridge. The clock tower loomed above, its hands turning faithfully onward. Holmes stopped and stared across the river. There is a temptation, Watson, in our line of work, to believe that the conclusion is the reward, that once the pieces fit, the world has righted itself. But this case, he paused, his breath curling in the cold air. It has taught me that resolution is not always alignment. Sometimes it is simply the point where the heart no longer resists the truth. And justice? I asked. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. Justice, he said, is a name we give to balance, even when we do not know who holds the scale. We returned to Baker Street as dusk crept through the chimneys. The fire was low, and Mrs. Hudson had left a plate of buttered crumpets by the hearth, untouched and cooling. Holmes removed his coat, sat at the table, and finally, picked up his pen. I recognized the envelope. It bore the address of Sir James Thorncroft, the very man who had permitted us access to the British Library during the final phase of the investigation. Holmes wrote plainly, cleanly, the way he always did when something in him had resolved. Sir, I am enclosing all relevant materials regarding the Glenross affair, including the ledger annotations and the associated depositions now in your possession. I recommend that the entire case be preserved within the legal archive under restricted status, to be reviewed in full only upon special application or scholarly inquiry. As to the matter of Miss Violet Grayson, no further pursuit is warranted. I trust you understand why. The truth as it stands has been spoken. Let it now be carried. Yours, S.H. He sealed the letter with wax, pressed it firm, and handed it to me. You'll deliver this in the morning. I took it without a word. That night Holmes did not play the violin, nor did he speak of the case again. But before I retired, I passed once more through the sitting room and saw him at the window, pipe in hand, watching the fog slip between the rooftops like the slow unfurling of thought. I knew what he was thinking. that some cases end with the criminal in cuffs, others with the innocent redeemed. But once in a rare while, a case ends with a simple question: who decides what the truth is worth? And even rarer still, a man like Holmes, for all his brilliance, his certainty, his command of facts, must admit that sometimes he is not the one who answers. He only listens, he observes, and then, as always, he lets it go. So I turned down the lamp and closed the door, leaving him in the quiet of the firelight. No longer the hunter, no longer the judge. Only a man bearing the weight of someone else's truth. It was a fortnight later when the final piece arrived, not with fanfare, but folded quietly between the pages of the London Gazette. I found it first, over breakfast, and passed it silently to Holmes. He unfolded the page without expression, eyes scanning the brief announcement buried beneath municipal notices and shipping appointments. Notice of probate, Violet Grayson, formerly of Finchley, deceased. Effects: Neil, personal statement recorded, to be remembered by none, to be forgotten by peace. I watched Holmes read the line twice. He placed the paper down, his fingers resting lightly atop the print, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She had chosen, at last, to vanish fully, beyond arrest, beyond watchful eyes, beyond even the burden of her own name. There had been no trial, no appeal, no charge laid. Lestrade had confirmed it days earlier. She had cooperated with the Yard, handed over the last of the documents, answered every question, and then requested release into privacy. The Commissioner, bowing to the quiet pressure of Thorncroft and others, had agreed. Now she was gone. Not erased, but concluded. Holmes stood and crossed to the window, the early light casting long shadows across the rug. She waited until the truth no longer needed her. He said it not as admiration, nor as lament, but as fact. Outside, Baker Street was already stirring. A newsboy called out the headlines, something about a trade accord with France, a fire near Limehouse. Life, as it always did, pressed forward, but I knew that somewhere in the great, indifferent rhythm of the city, a silence remained. Not guilt, not shame. Something deeper. Balance. Holmes turned, his features composed once more. "You've written the account?" "Yes," I said. "Though I suspect it will never be published. The world is not ready for this story." He smiled faintly. "That, Watson, is precisely why it must be written." He picked up his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and began to play, not his usual Schubert or Bach, but something slower, born of his own invention. It was not mournful, but neither was it triumphant. It moved like water down stone, clean, precise, but never cold. As I listened, I understood what I had always suspected, that Holmes had not merely solved Violet Grayson's case. He had respected it, respected her. Not because she defied the law, but because she understood something he rarely dared admit. That truth, real truth, is not a matter of what can be proved. It is what remains when everything else is stripped away. And so the ledger was sealed. The final name was crossed from the list, and in the quiet heart of Baker Street, with the violin echoing through the walls, Sherlock Holmes, who had pursued so many mysteries with the mind of a surgeon, allowed this one to end with the grace of a witness, not to guilt, but to mercy, 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 but to mercy.